Good evening to one and all present here, and good morning to Professor Allen.
Thank you.
We at Kirori College have been celebrating the Gandhi Week for the past 3 days now to celebrate the occasion of 150th birth anniversary of our beloved Bapu Mahatma Gandhi. The History Department of Kirori College, in collaboration with Internal Quality Assurance Cell IQAC of Kirori College, has organized this international webinar on the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi in the 21st century, discussing his philosophy, political ideas, social and spiritual dimensions. Over the last 3 days, we had the pleasure of meeting some renowned academicians who have worked extensively on Gandhian philosophies. Today, we are here to discuss two important ideas with Professor Allen. Is Mahatma Gandhi's challenging philosophy of violence and non-violence irrelevant? And the misinterpretations, misuses, and the reformulated significance of Gandhi's teachings for India today. Disturbance in the background. Can you guys hear me properly?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry for the disturbance in the background. There's some construction work. Anyway, continuing with my research for Professor Allen, I discovered that one of his papers he wrote with respect to ahimsa or non-violence, it may be easy to see how the value works against overt physical violence. However, for Gandhi, such examples are only a small part of violence overall. For Gandhi, violence and non-violence are multidimensional, encompassing our personal ego-driven desires and our widespread economic exploitation. Each dimension of violence and non-violence is both causal and conditioning, beginning with the experiences of children. Ahimsa should therefore be approached as a relational and interconnected. Gandhi approaches the structural violence of the status quo by insisting upon the transformative structural non-violence. I would now like to call Principal Ma'am to grace us with a few kind words about the seminar.
Thank you. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for you to initiate the seminar, and I am indeed very, very happy. I have digitally, informally just met Professor Allen, and it is a great pleasure, Professor Allen, just to exchange a few words with you. And you did ask our student about our previous 3 talks that we have had. They have been extremely, like she said, extremely enriching. And they covered various other aspects, starting from, I'm going to put it in a nutshell. Obviously, it doesn't comprehensively cover the complexity of the talk, but one was the gray areas, how to read the contradictions within Gandhi, that apparent contradictions that appear if one goes and goes through his works. The next talk was actually on peace and the international relevance of the idea of peace, whether it be diplomacy or whether it be the process, how peace is a dynamic value or concept. And then, of course, we had a talk about mainly the concept of speech, violence, non-violence, speechlessness, the politics of the speechlessness and the speechless. And I am indeed very, very happy to see that you have a very, very long title to your talk, which I think is the pinnacle now. It is, we are reaching the climax of our series of talks, yours being the final one. And tomorrow we have an open-ended discussion with the students. And this topic promises, I think, to hold, analyze, discuss, perhaps maybe touch upon what we have already been talking a bit. And Professor Allen, being a philosopher, I think there is going to be probably something, a touch of probably somebody trained in philosophy. Perhaps that would be something, a new slant which might be there in his talk. So Professor Allen, you can see we are waiting with great anticipation and wondering about what you would speak about. And to come to this point, actually, it has been a journey, and the people who made this possible, there are lots of them. First and foremost, our students, especially of history department, the department itself, Amit Suman, who has been in touch with you, the TIC of the department, other teachers, and we have another group, a cell called the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, IQAC in short, which is a cell which it's kind of responsible for up to raise the academic co-curricular standards of college teaching learning process. And this series of talk was held in collaboration with history department and IQAC. I'm grateful to the convener of IQAC, Dr. Anshu, and all the other members, along with those of the history department, to have given us this opportunity. It's a great opportunity, and I can only thank them and thank you, Professor Allen, to agree to talk across continents at a time which to us still looks a bit dark to us. You are fine, you are clearly visible. So welcome once again, and we are grateful. Thank you very much.
I now request Anshu ma'am to welcome the speaker.
Yeah. Good evening to everyone, and good morning to Professor Douglas. Thank you so much. And sorry if it's a little early there, but we are really happy to have you with us. And it is an immense pleasure. And as Principal Ma'am has already said that, I think that not inviting you earlier for the talks has been, I guess, been a miss from our part, and which we would like to see does not happen in the future. That's one. And I am the convener of the IQAC, but I'm really indebted to the history department and to Dr. Amit for putting this, collaborating with us and putting this webinar together, and inviting such illustrious speakers. And I think you are really a great one, a great philosopher in this list of speakers in this webinar. And you really added that glow to our webinar. And thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to speak to our students and the teachers and other research scholars from across the country. And I would just say that we've been having and deliberating on the various aspects what we relate with Gandhiji, and we have grown up, at least me and our contemporaries, we have grown up with Gandhi's philosophy, and we have seen how it's been critiqued, how he has been criticized, how he has been misinterpreted, and various things that have gone on. And I was greatly influenced by one of my travels in Champaran, where where I witnessed the unveiling of the statue of Gandhi, where it was not the traditional Gandhi that you see in the Padmasan, but it was actually, that statue is very different. But when you go to Champaran, it's actually the entire place kind of speaks to you about Gandhi. Gandhi suddenly becomes alive there. And it was a very touching experience to visit, and very emotional. Reading the plaque and looking at the entire statue, and looking at even the collectorate has the kind of the murals. So having said all that, I'd just say that this is one thing which I'd like to say to our students, that before we start making some ideas, I think it's very important to go to the original writings and read the commentaries which are given by experts rather than doing shortcuts of reading snippets. So I think that is something that really has led to a lot of misinterpretations of Gandhi's philosophy. But not standing between you and your very, very eager audience, sir. I'd like to welcome you again on behalf of the college. And thank you so much for taking out time for us. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Vagisha. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now like to request Sharanya to give us a brief introduction about Professor Allen. Over to you, Sharanya.
Good morning, sir, and good morning, everyone present here. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed guest for today's webinar, Professor Douglas Allen. Professor Allen is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Maine, USA, and is often recognized as the world's leading scholars in the phenomenology of religion and philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. Sir has specialized in philosophy from the world's most prestigious universities such as Yale, BHU, to name a few. Professor Allen has immensely contributed to the society as a peace and justice scholar as well as an activist. He has been active in several socio-political movements such as the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, and many other struggles resisting any form of violence and oppression. He is a recipient of several awards, such as the Hands of Peace Award in Maine. He has authored several celebrated books, such as Religion and Political Conflict in South Asia, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, Culture and Self, Philosophical and Religious Perspectives, East and West, etc., and written as many as 5 Gandhi-informed books. His major focus in recent decades has been on the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. He considers his philosophy as the solution to the grave problems the world faces today. In his works on Gandhi, he has emphasized the belief that for a sustainable and non-violent future, we must look up to Gandhi in a selective and creative manner. And his latest book, Gandhi After 9/11, Creative Nonviolence and Sustainability, deals with several questions, and one of the most important questions around which our webinar also revolves today, which is Gandhi significant or irrelevant to the 21st century? It is a great honor for everyone present here to be able to attend a talk by such a prominent scholar. Thank you, sir, for taking out time and being here today with us. I hope that today's webinar inspires ideas and discussions in all of us. And also, before we proceed, I would request all the participants that if they have any queries, they can write them down in the chat box below. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the 4 kind introductions. And I especially want to compliment the 2 students, both of whom really presented very intelligent introductions. I want to thank you for bestowing this honor of inviting me to deliver this lecture. I especially want to thank Professor Amit Suman, who invited me and who has been a wonderful contact and very helpful in arranging this. And also, I want to thank the history department of the college. And also, I've been very impressed looking at the program of how deeply involved the students have been in participating. Now, I've been to India for many years, starting with my youthful formative experiences in 1963 and 1964. In fact, I've seen more of India than I have of the USA. India, Indian philosophy, and M.K. Gandhi have been so central to my life, my values, my philosophy, and my nonviolent peace and justice activism. The title of my lecture is Mahatma Gandhi's challenging philosophy of violence and nonviolence irrelevant? Current misinterpretations, misuses, and the reformulated significance of Gandhi's teachings for India today. So I hope that this will be an engaging, thought-provoking, and meaningful presentation. And I look forward to your questions, your comments, your disagreements, and lively discussion after my presentation. So on Gandhi Jayanti and throughout this week, Indian leaders assemble at Porbandar, Gandhi's birthplace. They assemble and connect with you in Delhi and throughout India in order to pay ritualized homage to this remarkable Indian. Speakers ritually extol the larger-than-life M.K. Gandhi as Bapu, father of the nation, and as the Mahatma, the great political, moral, and spiritual soul. Many extol Gandhi as the idealized Hindu used ideologically to justify Hindu identity and Hindu-informed policies and actions in India and also in the Indian diaspora in the USA and elsewhere. So my question is, if Gandhi were alive today, how would he regard this celebratory reverence towards him? I shall submit that M.K. Gandhi remains the most admired person in India and arguably in the entire world, and certainly the most influential proponent of ahimsa. But he was controversial during his lifetime, and Gandhi remains even more controversial today. Gandhi, his teachings and his actions are interpreted in many contradictory ways. I shall discuss briefly how 4 classifications of interpreters in India today regard Gandhi in ways that, in my view, make him irrelevant. I shall maintain that Gandhi's values, teachings, practices, and message with regard to violence and nonviolence in 2020 are more relevant and desperately needed today than ever before. In confronting issues of violence, hatred, class exploitation and inequality, gender, racial, ethnic, and religious oppression, immorality, untruthfulness, and environmental unsustainability. But Gandhi is sold only if we reinterpret and reapply his message selectively, rejecting what is reactionary and irrelevant in Gandhi, reformulating Gandhi's legacy in ways that are contextually relevant today, and integrating Gandhian perspectives with complementary non-Gandhian contributions. So let me just very, very briefly describe a little bit of my introduction to India, which will help to frame my presentation on how we can approach Gandhi and his philosophy. So I was very fortunate. I came to India, I was 21, 22, just after I graduated, a week after graduating from Yale University. I had a special Fulbright. I was stationed in Benares, Varanasi, and at Benares Hindu University, where I taught one upper level course, and I mainly took postgraduate PhD courses in Indian philosophy at what was arguably the #1 philosophy department in all of India. My main professor, T.R.V. Murthy, was a famous Indian philosopher, and he was the president of the All India Philosophical Congress that year. And most of the professors at that time at BHU were very distinguished Vedantists, usually disciples of Shankaracharya, the Advaita, non-dualism philosophy. Now, I mention this because Gandhi's presence was everywhere, right? All the vice chancellors, all the politicians and figures, they would wear their khadi vest, the Gandhi khadi vest. They would wear their Gandhi caps. They would make speeches in the words of the Mahatma and so forth, even if there was a gap between what they would say and what they would practice, right? But in the Department of Philosophy, for an entire year, I do not believe that Gandhi's name was mentioned even once. He was never mentioned. We studied Shankar, we studied Vedas, Upanishads, Gita, we studied Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, we studied the Pali Canon, we studied Nagarjuna, Madhyamaka, and so forth. Gandhi was never mentioned because Gandhi was not considered a philosopher, right? So this was my training. And then Gandhi was very significant in my life. I returned to the United States. I was in the South, in the segregated South for 3 years, in the Civil Rights Movement, then the anti-war movement, for years, Vietnam War movement for years, and they continued to my anti-war activism today. For 10 years, I was deeply immersed in the anti-apartheid movement, and so many other struggles continuing to the present day. So Gandhi was important as an activist, nonviolent, peace, justice activist, but not as a philosopher. That changed in the 1990s when I realized that Gandhi was not an academic philosopher, a disciplinary philosopher, but Gandhi was philosophically more significant than 90% of what was being done in my field of philosophy. So for about, I'd say, the last 26 years, I started publishing, lecturing, writing on Gandhi, doing research on Gandhi, resulting, as was said, in many books and probably more than 50 journal articles and book chapters that are Gandhi informed, and that's continued to the present. Okay, so here are, let me present 4 approaches, general approaches to Gandhi today, that in my view make him largely irrelevant. And this may challenge some of your positions. It certainly challenges a lot of the dominant positions in India today. And so, I look forward to your feedback, your questions, and interactions. First, there are dedicated Gandhian devotees, many I know and have visited, who live in Gandhi ashrams, and other Gandhi interpreters who admire, extol. In fact, sometimes they even deify the Mahatma. Almost, I've described it, becomes a kind of Gandhian fundamentalism. What would the Mahatma do? For them, Gandhi is the saintly, perfected, exemplary Mahatma. And his writings and teachings are the scriptures, providing us with the perfect nonviolent blueprint, with all of the nonviolent solutions for our personal and worldly problems. Unfortunately, as was the case during his lifetime, and as remains true today, Gandhi is regarded as too good for this world. And we continue to ignore Gandhi's perfect nonviolent teachings and practices, resulting in our anti-Gandhian world of so much violence. The second group expresses a wide variety of diverse anti-Gandhian critics. Interestingly, they also present a rigid, absolute, decontextualized Gandhi. However, for the anti-Gandhians, Gandhi's so-called perfect nonviolent solutions are no solutions at all. At best, Gandhi was well-intentioned but naive and unrealistic. At worst, Gandhi was and remains complicit with and part of the problem of violent caste oppression, class exploitation, gender and ethnic oppression, and much more. And he and his philosophy are an obstacle to progress. Third, there are the economically and politically powerful modern Indians who Gandhi identifies with, quote, modern civilization, unquote, in Hind Swaraj and in other works. These are non-Gandhians and anti-Gandhian expressions of the corporate and financial capitalist elite, top scientists and engineers, medical, those promoting fossil fuel and military and nuclear domination, and those with power shaping mass media and the dominant culture. Today, these modern human beings identify with neoliberal corporate capitalism, profit maximization, globalization, ego-driven materialism, and consumerism, worship of technology, militarism, multidimensional forms of violence, and the domination of nature. For them and their worldview, Gandhi is irrelevant. Fourth, there are leading political and economic figures, political parties, and many other influential Indians who now extol Gandhi as an exceptional Indian, as a great Hindu. But they use Gandhi to justify their anti-Gandhian violent values, policies, and goals. In the past, many of these same Indian leaders and groups viciously attacked Gandhi as a traitor, an enemy of Hindu India, who weakened Indians, who was responsible for partition and was responsible for Kashmir, who preferred Muslims over Hindus, and much more. Today, they extol the Mahatma, but use this ideologically to deflect attention away from their extreme anti-Gandhian, violent, intolerant, divisive, political, economic, military, nuclear, and other priorities, values, policies, and objectives. Okay, so let me come now to my alternative. Here's a little bit on my interpretation of Gandhi's view of philosophy, and especially his philosophy of violence and nonviolence that informs his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, his ethics, and his ontology or metaphysics, his view of reality. So I just want to mention two features of Gandhi's general approach to philosophy. The first is Gandhi emphasizes the primacy of practice. Unlike most philosophers, Indian, Eastern, and especially Western, Gandhi is not at all interested in abstract theories, right? Even with nonviolence, Gandhi is not very interested in some abstract theoretical philosophy of nonviolence. No, Gandhi emphasizes practice. In other words, for Gandhi, philosophy is important, but only as it is action-oriented. Gandhi is interested in philosophy as lived philosophy. Gandhi is interested in philosophy as transformative. Some people think, well, Gandhi is just a practical person who has no interest in concepts or theories, right? And that's not true. Gandhi is very interested in concepts, theory, but not as abstract theory, but as a guide to action, as arising out of practice and as informing new practice. Gandhi is interested in concepts and theories, philosophy as transformative, as how we can understand and apply it so it can help us to transform those relations and structures of violence in the direction of greater and greater nonviolence. The second feature of Gandhi's approach to philosophy is that it is holistic. It is holistic. It is organic. In Gandhi's view to existence, to truth, to reality, he emphasizes the interconnectedness of all of life. Gandhi emphasizes the oneness, the basic oneness of reality, of truth. Gandhi emphasizes this unity, this fundamental essential unity, what unifies us, what unites us as human beings, with other human beings, with other sentient life, with nature. What unifies us is more basic than what divides us, what separates us. But for Gandhi, this is a unity with a respect for differences. In other words, it's different from what I was taught by many of those great Vedantas, Advaitins in Benares and up to the present day. Namely, Gandhi does not dismiss differences, otherness, as Maya, as mere illusion. When we realize truth, it all is sublated. It all disappears. It's simply ignorant. No, Gandhi recognizes our basic interconnected unity, but with a respect for differences. Others contextually have different paths to truth and reality than I do, legitimate paths. And in fact, they have different perspectives of what is real. Right? And in fact, I can learn from others. This is part of Gandhi's tolerance, mutual respect, engaging the other. The other has truths that I may not have. And engaging them, I can learn and develop my own truths in much greater and deeper ways. Okay, so those are two features. And now let me focus on the main thing, which is Gandhi's particular philosophy of violence and nonviolence. In Gandhi's approach, there are two basic concepts, philosophical concepts. One is Satya, and the other is Ahimsa. Because Gandhi has a holistic, interconnected view of reality, you can start with other key concepts in Gandhi. You can start, for example, with Satyagraha. You can start with Swaraj. You can start with Swadeshi. You can start with Sarvodaya. You can start with the different concepts in the constructive work, right? The constructive program. And you can show then how all these different values and concepts are interconnected. But in hundreds and hundreds of passages, Gandhi makes clear that for him, the two basic foundational concepts are Satya and Ahimsa. So since my focus is going to be on Ahimsa, I'll just be very brief on Satya, which Gandhi defines as truth. And for Gandhi, he takes this term from the Sanskrit Sat, which is in the Upanishads, the ancient scriptures and philosophies. Sat meaning that which is real, being, existence. And so for Gandhi, the way he uses Satya here as the truth, what is real, what really exists, it's this sense of that which is permanent underlying this world of impermanence, that which is eternal underlying this temporal world of change, that which is absolute underlying our world of relativity. And he uses this interchangeably, Satya, truth, what is real, right, being. He equates that in many passages with God, right? Gandhi at the beginning says God is truth. And then he reverses that later to be more inclusivist and says truth is God for those who believe in God. And so Gandhi often talks about Satya as God, sometimes defines it in terms of Rama, sometimes defines it in terms of Krishna, and many other formulations of God, East and West. He often equates this with the spiritual soul, right? Or spiritual self, the Atman, and many other formulations of self, okay? So one thing I want to clarify is in terms of this view that Gandhi has of truth, of reality, which distinguishes him from many of the Indian and Western metaphysical essentialized view of truth. For Gandhi, this is not some abstract theoretical formulation. Gandhi wants to emphasize truth is a force. It's a force. In fact, Gandhi says that Satya as truth force is the most powerful force that human beings can experience and that we can experience in reality. And truth force is this active, dynamic force that brings together all the fragmented aspects of existence, of reality, of nature, into meaningful, organic, interconnected wholes. Now, my main focus is here now going to be on Ahimsa. Gandhi, of course, is the most famous and influential proponent of Ahimsa. So let me just briefly clarify. This term appears for thousands of years in Indian scriptures and religions and philosophies. Gandhi was influenced by many Hindu sources. Gandhi was especially influenced by Jainism. Within Jainism, Ahimsa is one of the fundamental teachings and concepts, and he's also influenced by Buddhist approaches and also by some very significant Western approaches, Tolstoy and others. So looking just at the etymology, the term of course, refers to the negative, not. Himsa is harm, injury. So ahimsa means no harm, no injury. And the way it's most often translated into English as nonviolence. And for Gandhi, again, this is the primacy is on practice, not some abstract theory. How can we actually live our lives consistent with nonviolence, with benevolent harmlessness? Now, one area it's important to clarify is that because Gandhi is greatly indebted to many Indian roots of ahimsa, but he also challenges most Indian traditional approaches to ahimsa in philosophy, in spirituality, because Gandhi says he considers them too passive, simply don't do harm, don't injury, avoid that, which of course is very important for Gandhi. But for Gandhi, ahimsa is active. It's not passive at all. In fact, he claims it's the most active force possible. Nonviolence is a much more active force than any forms of violence. Okay, so we have to clarify now what ahimsa is for Gandhi. And as was presented in the first introduction today, on one level, Gandhi is referring to overt physical violence and corresponding nonviolence. Most of you, I think my students, most others I know, if you ask them, is nonviolent, they'll affirm very easily, nonviolence is better than violence. Peace is better than war. Right? Love is better than hatred. Justice is better than injustice. Kindness, compassion are better than cruelty, than mean-spiritedness. Right? You can easily grant that. Usually then they qualify it. They say, well, unfortunately, we live in a world that's not like that. And so sometimes we need to use violence in order to achieve nonviolence. We need war to achieve peace. We have to think about, number one, ourselves, unfortunately, simply to get on, be successful, or survive in this world, okay? So what Gandhi says is, on the one hand, overt physical, and usually people who say that restrict violence to overt forms. In other words, what they're saying is, I'm against just killing. I'm against torture. I'm against just this kind of forms of terrorism. I'm against rape. I'm against bullying. I'm against domestic violence and so forth. Of course, Gandhi is against all those things, right? And Gandhi takes very seriously overt physical violence. After all, he was assassinated, finally, by an act, right? He was shot 30 January 1948 by Gandhi, by an act of overt physical violence, okay? But what Gandhi is saying is overt physical violence is only a very small part, maybe 10% of overall violence. And hence, most of us who claim that we are very nonviolent actually are very violent, at least complicit with, and often contribute or benefit from violence. So how can Gandhi say that? That's the challenge. How can he say that? So in my own work, I developed two main concepts of how Gandhi greatly broadens and deepens our understanding of violence and nonviolence. First is what I call the multidimensionality of violence, and hence corresponding nonviolence. Gandhi says, in addition to overt physical violence, for example, we have psychological violence. We have inner violence. a lot of people, even if they don't beat someone up, physically shoot someone, if they are full of rage, full of anger and rage, they are very violent people. And this psychological violence will come out in different forms, how they relate to themselves, how they relate to family, to others, to nature. In addition to psychological violence, Gandhi spends a lot of time on linguistic violence. That's one reason he so emphasized the youngest children through language acquisition, how they are socialized, right, through language to understand the world in which they are living and how to express themselves. So language can be very violent. It can be used to shame people, to guilt trip people, to manipulate people, to control people, right? In all kinds of forms, not just the obvious ones we see coming out of Washington today and in different parts of India today and so forth. But for example, parents can use language in very violent ways towards children or spouses or others. Teachers can use language in a very violent way towards students in order to shame students, to control students, to make students, to humiliate students. So Gandhi emphasizes language. As Gandhi spends the most time, even though Gandhi is mainly a moralist, to me, Gandhi is mainly a great ethical thinker and practitioner. Gandhi mainly wants you to live virtuous lives, compassionate lives, lives of caring, selfless service to meet the needs of others, especially the most disadvantaged. Gandhi actually spends the most time on economic violence. Gandhi equates economic violence with exploitation. In many passages, Gandhi talks about poverty as the worst form of violence, 90% of poverty being humanly caused and maintained. Gandhi talks about the asymmetrical, hierarchical relationships between the economic haves, those who control, dominate the means of production, the natural resources, the factories, the machines, the technology, communications, all of these things. People who are the economic haves, the small minority, and the overwhelming majority of economic have-nots, who do not own or control the means of production and the other economic power relations, and hence are dependent on the economic haves. For Gandhi, that is structurally, inherently violent. Okay, Gandhi talks about cultural violence, ethnic violence. As you know, Gandhi spends a lot of time on religious violence. Hierarchical, traditional, structural religion, both externally and internally, tends to be very, very violent. Gandhi talks about caste violence. He talks about gender violence. He talks about educational violence. Gandhi talks about how nationalism, you can have state violence, right? So Gandhi talks a lot about what we call the military-industrial complex, or military-industrial economic, state complex, how all of this is very violent. So we have the multidimensionality of, when you think about that, it really bursts open how you regard violence and nonviolence in your own lives and in the world in which you're living. Gandhi's second concept I emphasize is the structural violence of the status quo. Business as usual. What we often take as normal, if there's not active resistance and disruption, we just say, well, that's the way things are. That's reality, right? And what Gandhi is saying is in India, I'll say India, I could talk just as easily, even more about the US and other parts of the world. He's saying in India, your dominant economic system is structurally, the normal system, when it's functioning smoothly, is structurally violent. The normal political system, when it's functioning smoothly, is violent, right? The normal mass media, consumerist system, when it's functioning smoothly, is structurally violent. You can develop all of this. What Gandhi is saying, you see, in this way is that and the fact that people don't rebel, that they just suffer, right? From poverty, from exploitation, from injustice, from violence. Why? They're passive, they feel powerless. Often if they did rebel, those with power have all ways of persecuting them, imprisoning them, punishing them, sometimes killing them, raping them. The fact that people suffer passively or blame themselves or say this is just human nature, or in terms of law of karma, things will be better in the next world or will be better in heaven, whatever. Gandhi says that doesn't make that structural violence any less violent. So when you combine multidimensionality of violence with the structural violence of the status quo, you can see how the Gandhian understanding of violence, and in each of these cases, the need for transformative, multi-dimensional and structural nonviolence, it totally changes how we understand ourselves and our world in which we live. Now, for Gandhi, current dominant hatred, divisiveness, and dehumanization of others is as essentially other and not like us, is violent. Economic and social inequality between the haves and the have-nots is essentially violent. Humanly created and maintained poverty is violent. The construction of the immoral and untruthful modern ego-defined individual with its ego desires and attachments and possessiveness is essentially violent. Xenophobic state nationalism is violent. The dominant hierarchical, institutionalized economic, political, social, cultural, media, religious, class, caste, gendered, and educational systems are multidimensionally and structurally violent. They reject the inclusivist, interconnected, egalitarian, decentralized, substantively democratic, multi-sided, tolerant, dharma-based, moral and truthful basis of Gandhi's vision, teachings, and practices for 2020. Now, just to develop this, as you all know, Gandhi is very famous for his means ends analysis in his philosophy and all areas of his life. And so Gandhi, on the most basic level, is saying, if you cannot use immoral, violent, untruthful means in order to achieve nonviolent, moral, truthful ends, the means will shape the ends, which then become new means, and you will become entrapped in endless, vicious, destructive cycles of violence. In the opposite way, if you use nonviolent means, compassion, love, caring, kindness, selfless service, means that are moral, means that are truthful, these will lead to more nonviolent, more moral, more truthful ends, which then become new means. And you gradually are transforming those cause effects relative cycles in the greater direction of nonviolence. So for Gandhi, modern students, I would say, and modern human beings, with their modern views that the ends justify the means, accept the immoral and untruthful view that we can use means that involve control, violence, militarism, oppression, exploitation, injustice, sexism, casteism, and environmental destruction in order to achieve modern ends of wealth, power, hierarchical, racial, gendered, religious, and other domination, and other objectives. This often involves ideological justifications by appealing to anti-Gandhian concepts of, quote, peace, unquote, that is really unjust and violent, materialistically defined development, and modern criteria for happiness and prosperity. In Gandhi's interpretation of violence and nonviolence, we are socialized today to accept the assumptions and values of neoliberal corporate capitalism, profit maximization, globalization, ego-driven materialism, consumerism, worship of technology, militarism, multidimensional forms of violence, and the exploitation and domination of nature. Now, one other important point I want to make on means ends. There are many, including many important Gandhian and Gandhian scholars who focus on means. And what they say is you can use nonviolent means to be successful. In other words, nonviolent means can be used as a technique, as a strategy, not a philosophy, not a creed, but you can simply use nonviolent means. For example, there are many studies, even very influential funding in the United States as well, and especially in India. You can use Gandhian means in prisons. Prisoners are angry. They're unruly. Gandhian means can pacify them, can make them calmer, make them easier to rule prisoners. You can use all kinds of Gandhian means in business, right? We have many professors of business in India today who are applying Gandhian values about how, in fact, you can run your corporation better with less alienation between the workers and management. You can reach out in Gandhian means to consumers so that they become more loyal consumers and buy products and so forth. What I want to say is a lot of truth to all of that, or a lot of insights in all of that. But what it doesn't raise, what to me is important in Gandhi's view of nonviolence and truth, is that this violates Gandhi's basic philosophy. It's using Gandhi as a means to achieve anti-Gandhian ends. So let me just quickly suggest something on the ontological level that's often ignored. Gandhi does have a view of reality, ontology, a view of truth, of reality. And what Gandhi says is violence not only produces immoral ends, destructive ends, but in fact, it's inconsistent with the nature of reality. How can he say that? What Gandhi is saying, when I'm being violent, right, towards the other, whether it's individual other, whether it's family other, neighbors, classmates, communities, caste, genders, religions, nations, whatever level it is. When I'm being violent, I'm making an essential, fundamental presupposition, basic value, and a basic view, worldview, that the other is essentially different from me, unlike me. This is an ontological distinction between self, myself, and the other who is radically other. And what that means, Gandhi says, for thousands of years throughout history and today, when I do that, I objectify the other, I dehumanize the other, I usually consider the other is devalued, the other is superstitious, the other is backwards, the other is how the British regarded Indians, Hindus as idol worshippers and so forth. The other is irrational, right? The other is unethical, less ethical than I am. The other is evil. Not only that, but the other is impure and threatens, in fact, the purity of my group, right? Myself, my religion, my nation. And what this leads to then is the need that I have to develop all these defensive mechanisms against the threat of the other. And in fact, even if necessary, to imprison, to torture, to exterminate, right? The other as essentially other. By contrast, ontologically, Gandhi is saying, what does nonviolence do? When I act with ahimsa nonviolently, it's not just it produces better ends, more moral ends, but in addition, it's a way of realizing the nature of truth and reality. When I act nonviolently, this is based on the view of the essential unity, my essential, on a primordial level, my essential unity with the other. At the most fundamental level, the other and I. Basically, what we share is most essential, right? So when I act nonviolently with love, with compassion, with truth force, and so forth, this is a way of bringing me into meaningful, loving, compassionate relations with the other, which is consistent with, in fact, the nature of the interconnectedness and oneness of all of reality. So let me conclude by just saying a little bit on Gandhi's philosophy of violence and nonviolence as relevant for Gandhi 150 today and for the future of India. Gandhi-informed thought, philosophy, and practices are certainly relevant, indeed more relevant than ever in addressing our current crises of violence, war, conflict, hatred, divisiveness, exploitation, inequality, caste and gender and racial and ethnic and religious oppression, imperialism, xenophobic nationalism, alienation and lack of human flourishing, economic and environmental unsustainability. What is now needed, in my view, is for us to engage Gandhi through creatively selective readings, interpretations, and applications, and open-ended, dynamic, contextually relevant rereadings, reinterpretations, and reapplications. In doing this, we honor Gandhi and his legacy, while recognizing that Gandhi does not have all of the solutions to all of our violent crises. We must integrate our Gandhian approaches, perspectives, philosophies, and practices with complementary non-Gandhian approaches that have valuable insights with regard to contemporary crises that focus on class and caste, race and gender, religious and communal, conflict, science, medicine, technology, and environmental sustainability. So to me, this is what's needed now and how we best address our contemporary crises and how we'll be able to provide more positive, moral, nonviolent, truthful, Gandhi-informed alternatives. and Gandhi is a catalyst who to a normal comfort level. He challenges us to think outside the box. As he did throughout his lifetime, Gandhi not only offers a theoretical analysis of violence, he mainly offers action-oriented practice and challenges for us to raise our transformative consciousness, to mobilize unifying nonviolent, moral, and truthful resistance, and to create positive Gandhi-informed contemporary alternatives. As during his lifetime, Gandhi's legacy today is to serve as a catalyst to make us deeply uncomfortable with dominant modern life that is so violent, so that we are motivated to reimagine, reconceptualize, recontextualize, creatively and selectively reformulate and reapply how to live nonviolently, morally, truthfully, and sustainably in our world of 2020 and in the future. So I want to thank you for your patience and attentiveness, and I look forward now to your comments, any feedback, any questions, any disagreements. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. That was an insightful lecture, and I am bubbling with a lot of questions. So I would like, the floor is now open for questions. You can drop it here in the chat box, or you can just write your name and I'll read out your question. I'm going to start with my question first because I don't see any other questions here. Sir, correct me if I'm wrong. From what I understood from your lecture is that nonviolence and truth are, as a philosophy, as Gandhi's philosophy, are going to transform the world if we use it creatively in terms of tackling with problems of xenophobia and sexism, racism. All these problems will be solved if we just start adapting to nonviolence. Sir, I just feel like it's a little far-fetched of an idea. So if you could ground that for me, I would be really grateful. I just feel it's like, how do you connect those problems?
Yes. Yeah. So thank you. And in fact, because of time, I did not spend any time on one of the key concepts in how I interpret Gandhi's truth and nonviolence, which is, for me, Gandhi would also find what you just said correctly about that approach as being far-fetched. And it would not reflect, in fact, his own life, because Gandhi struggled with all those issues right to the end. You know, people, when they talk, Gandhi has all the solutions, the Mahatma, they forget. Gandhi, at different times in his life, and especially the last few years of his life, Gandhi was so depressed. He was so demoralized, so depressed. In despair, he often said, I'm a failure, because he had been working on some of these issues of conflict and violence for 40, 50 years. And now he's living through the partition, the horrors, the genocide, the rapes, and he's saying, no one's listening to me. When it comes to Hindu, Muslim, and other communal violence, when it comes to caste violence, when it comes to rape and certain gender violence, he says, even many of my followers, right, the Satyagrahis, he says, they never really believed in my philosophy, right? Just they used it as a technique because it was useful. But now we see that, so when you realize that, that makes Gandhi so much more real. And for me, I've written at length elsewhere about how, for example, most of my students and others, even right now living in Trumpian United States, they are so depressed. They are so shocked. They cannot believe what is happening. And the effect is they become demoralized, right? They withdraw because they feel powerless, that no one cares what I have to say. Gandhi was the opposite. It's incredible. How did he tap into all of this energy? While he was feeling despair, demoralized, he was activated. And in many cases, he was incredibly successful in dealing with violence in the last period of his life. Now, so the big distinction that I didn't make, that your question, very good question, raises, is this most important distinction between the absolute and the relative. Gandhi does have these absolute ideals of ahimsa, of Satya, but what people ignore is 90% of Gandhi's focus on truth and nonviolence is on relative truth and relative nonviolence. The need to contextualize it, where you don't have a simple blueprint, where in fact Gandhi himself mentions in his Experiments with Truth, his autobiography, Gandhi makes hundreds of errors. He miscalculates. He is so doesn't have easy answers. He describes some of them as Himalayan blunders, that they are so bad. And Gandhi says we can learn from our errors. Well, even when we think we're acting truthfully and nonviolently, we find that often we act violently and untruthfully. So what you have to see, it makes Gandhi so much more real when you say, okay, Gandhi has these ideals that are very important, but how do we apply them? How do we contextualize them in terms of our own life, right? Our own university, our own community, our own nature, our own nation, our own world. And then you find it's very complex. I'll give you one last example, because people always say, oh, Gandhi is the absolute proponent of ahimsa. Yes, Gandhi believes in the absolute ideals of nonviolence. But Gandhi says everyone, including M.K. Gandhi, is necessarily violent. Simply by existing in this world as a human being, you commit violence. Even when you have the best of intention, Gandhi says, and not just towards other human beings. For Gandhi, for example, when you practice hygiene, just basic hygiene, you let in the sunlight, you build a road, you construct a house. And so in all of those, you are committing some himsa, some injury, some violence. So this makes, I'll just give one last example, because all of this you could relate to. I came to India in 2008, just after the Mumbai terrorist attacks. And I arrived there, this was just weeks later, and I was supposed to give a keynote in Jaipur, and just before they changed it, they said, talk about what Mahatma Gandhi would say about the terrorist attacks at the train station, in the Taj and Oberoi hotel, in the coffee shop, in the different places, right? And the atmosphere, and people warned me, they said, don't say Mahatma Gandhi believes in nonviolence. People will want to kill you. Because people were, the media, the political scientists there and so forth, the atmosphere, and you can understand why, the atmosphere is, let's, an eye for an eye, Pakistan is a failed state, let's eliminate Pakistan for all. Just now we're going to teach them a lesson, we're just going to get rid of them. And people thought, and so what was interesting is how to deal with that. And then the next year I had a whole sabbatical. I was based in Mumbai at the Gandhi place there where he always stayed. And my whole year was on terrorism and Gandhi. And I worked with a lot of the national security people in India, some of the generals, the head of the police in Mumbai, and so forth. And what I said, and people were shocked, when you apply Gandhian nonviolence, Gandhi would not simply say to the terrorists, say in the train station or in the hotel, kill me, I won't take a life, I won't do, just kill me. Because when you apply that, what they would do is they would just kill him and then they keep killing everyone else. So Gandhi is contextually aware that there are some situations in which there are no nonviolent alternatives, right? You can't say you don't have an absolute nonviolent blueprint. 90-something% of the time that we are violent, there are nonviolent alternatives, right? But there are cases where there is no nonviolent alternative that could be effective. In that case, violence is necessary. It's never moral. Gandhi said violence is never moral, but it may be necessary. But when you practice violence, and this makes Gandhi so much more real, right? When you practice violence, never glorify the violence. What you do is horrible. This is tragic that you have to be violent. This shows a human failure. Why did we not create a world in which such violence is not necessary? So Gandhi says when you have to be violent, limit the duration, the extent of your violence, no collateral damage. There's a good lesson right now for the pandemic in the US and India in that regard, where millions of people are dying who could be alive. Limit your violence, and then, most importantly, do everything in your power to change the condition that gave rise to that violence. Otherwise, you'll be entrapped in endless cycles, using terror to defeat terrorism. You'll be living in a world of endless terror, using, and so forth. So that's a very long response, trying to clarify just some of the things I didn't bring up in my my talk, but I'm glad you raised that.
So the distinction between the absolute and relative truths is a very important one, and it places all the things into context. Thank you so much for that wonderful reply. I'll move on to the other questions now. The next question is by Altaf Hussain. Sir, as you work on Gandhi after 9/11, so do you think that Gandhi's thought and philosophy is relevant to solve India-Pakistan relations? Second, some people are saying Hindutva is Gandhi's philosophy. What is your take on this claim?
So the first part was on the India-Pakistan relations. And what was the second part that you mentioned?
That Hindutva is Gandhi's philosophy, the philosophy of Hindutva.
Yeah.
That's Gandhi's philosophy. Some people are claiming that. What is your...
Yes. Okay. On Hindutva. Okay, those are, again, two very, very good questions. So, to me, in solving the India-Pakistan relations, Gandhi is necessary, but not sufficient. I might say in 2 days, I'm giving another virtual lecture, and it's for the university in Jammu and Kashmir. So these concerns are very relevant. Gandhi does not have simple answers. Obviously, Gandhi during his lifetime was incapable. Gandhi did not support the partition. This is often misunderstood. And in fact, when India's independence was declared at the Red Fort by Pandit Nehru, the tryst with destiny, and they wanted Gandhi to be there. Gandhi was not there. In fact, he was trying to deal with the communal violence in Calcutta. And for Gandhi, the partition was a tragedy. It wasn't a great accomplishment. But Gandhi felt he had no say. People weren't listening, that they didn't want to hear what he had to say. And he reached out to Jinnah. He kept reaching out to Jinnah, just desperately trying to avoid the partition. That was impossible. And so that Gandhi did not solve the India-Pakistan problem, right? And considered it a failure. And Gandhi does not have a simple solution. So I think for my approach is, and this is part of the need for engaged dialogue and discussion that happens every time I come to India or when I talk with Pakistanis and others. What are the issues? Do we want to have some solution? What would the solution look like? And this is multifaceted, multidimensional. There are wonderful people I know in India, so many, who they're trying to reach out to people in Pakistan. Even often through cricket, often through music, great Sufi singers. There's so many ways that Pakistanis relate to, not just through food, through culture, there's so much that they greatly admire that's in India, right? And there's so much that India can also relate to that are parts of Pakistan, but they're secondary parts. Those are not the dominant voices in India, and especially the dominant voices in Pakistan. Obviously, I am much more sympathetic to what's happening in India than I am to, Pakistan. But I realize that, in fact, for mutuality, there have to be attempts for people who are doing Gandhian and other nonviolent, moral, truthful ways of trying to reach out. I have friends who are in Kashmir and in other places who are putting their lives on the line every day and trying to do that kind of work that could bring about some gradual solution to avoid nuclear holocaust, which is very, very dangerous, and environmental destruction, which is very, very dangerous, and other crises. Now, the Hindutva thing, and it's interesting, I try to contextualize. When I come to India often, a lot of people during my sabbaticals, even last year in India, they are proponents of Hindutva. And some of them now who hated Gandhi 20, 30 years ago when I would talk with them, they now say Gandhi believed in Hindutva, including the head of RSS, others and so forth, make that claim. So to me, this is a misappropriation of Gandhi. Hindutva is very complex. I tried to always empathize, understand what people are feeling, what they're reacting against, not to stereotype them. But if I look at dominant forms of Hindutva, including on different campuses in India, where I've spent a lot of time, they tend to be very divisive. They make the self-other distinction. Often Dalits, Ambedkarites, untouchables, I know, students are living under terror. Often professors I know at many of these campuses are living under terror. They're afraid what they say in a classroom because someone could record it and put it out that they are anti-Hindu, that they are anti-Indians, they are unpatriotic. So to me, if I look at the dominant forms of Hindutva that are dominant in India today, to me, on the most basic level, even when they extol Gandhi, they are using him for very anti-Gandhian purposes in terms of divisiveness, in terms of hatred, in terms of violence towards the other. And it reflects, incidentally, I might say, a lot of what we are experiencing in the United States today as well. So for Gandhi, even the Hindutva nationalistic view, the xenophobic view, this is not Gandhi. Gandhi is very critical of that kind. Gandhi thinks Hinduism is exceptional. India's exceptional. Gandhi does believe that, especially the way the imperialists, the Westerners, have devalued, dismissed India. But Gandhi is against a kind of Indian nationalistic chauvinism, which all the time, even by some people who are kind to me in inviting me, but they believe that Indians are not just exceptional, they are the best. They're the most moral, they're the most advanced culturally, the most exceptional in this very narrow, intolerant, chauvinistic way. And for me, Gandhi, this is anti-Gandhian, and Gandhi would be struggling against that. Those are big questions. What would be another question?
Sir, how many more questions would you like to answer? Because we have about 15 questions. Let's take up 4-5 more, and then they
Okay,
can
good.
rest of them.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on, the next question is Jyotirmay Jishnu. As a student from India and having very less access to foreign syllabus, I'm really curious to know how is Gandhi explained to people in some colonizing master countries, seeing how famous Gandhi is.
Yeah. Okay. I would say if you ask most students in the United States what they thought of Mahatma Gandhi, the answer would be they thought nothing about him. Usually they don't know the first thing. They've never read a word of Gandhi. Maybe they saw the Hollywood Gandhi movie made in the early 1980s. Often that's their only exposure to Gandhi, if anything. And Gandhi's irrelevant. They're into their technology, their Instagrams, right? Their Facebook, their Twitter accounts. They're into computers, business, whatever. Gandhi is irrelevant, right? They know nothing about Gandhi. And that's often true of a lot of students in India too, I might say, in my experience, who say that. They say, well, maybe my grandparents knew something about Gandhi, but I don't know Gandhi, right? So they know nothing. And if they know anything, maybe they've heard a few things like something like, be the change you want in the world, or my life is my message, or something like that. Having said that, there are a significant minority of students in the United States, many of my students and others throughout the country, who in fact are very interested in Gandhi because they feel very alienated from their world in which they're living, personally, socially, nationally. In other words, most of my students are quite skeptical and alienated about the future. They feel we're living in a world that's unsustainable and that their future is being sacrificed by people with power who don't care about them, just care about their short-term profits and gains and control. So I have many, many students, as there are others, who really think that Gandhi is one of the most important resources that there can be for how they can live a more meaningful life. For example, how they can have real friends, how they can have meaningful relationships with family, with neighbors, and how they can flourish. In other words, how they can have greater control over their own lives, greater empowerment, right, in order to live more meaningful lives. So in that way, I think Gandhi is going to become, in the coming years, even more and more relevant and significant for people for my students and others in the United States and in the West.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Mr. Sumit Kumar. Anderson, in his account of Indian nationalism, the Indian ideology, charges that Gandhi's intellectual development was arrested by intense religious belief. What is your opinion on this argument?
Yes, well, you know, there's several different scholars disagree on that. That is a common position. There's a book series I edit that a book was published in 2019 by someone named Sanjay Lal, right, on Gandhian liberal democracy. He argues the exact opposite. I think it depends how we use the term religion in that regard. For example, there are many I know, including many of my students, they don't like the word religion because of institutionalized religion. They feel religion on the whole is more of the problem than the solution. But they like words like spirituality. They'll say, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And when they say that, in fact, it has a lot, even quite a bit to do with what I presented on Gandhi's approach to truth. So I think it depends. There are passages in Gandhi, quite frankly, that are religious that I find are very reactionary and not helpful, where he comes out with certain faith, religious positions that cannot be verified in terms of intersubjective. In other words, it's like if you don't have that faith, it's not going to be true for you. And he knows what's right regardless. And some of it can be very superstitious to me and very ill-informed. But there are other aspects of Gandhi's view towards religion or spirituality, I would say, which in fact are not an impediment to nationalism, but help us to critique most of the modern forms of nationalism, which can be very limited, very violent, very dangerous. And Gandhi provides sometimes a kind of religious spiritual critique that I think we can learn a lot today. When Gandhi talks about the integration of the whole person, the body, the mind, and then he says also the heart or the soul, and how all of those have to be integrated, which often the modern state, national state, does not, right? I think that there's a lot that's invaluable there as well. As long as, that's why I say, as long as we creatively appropriate what is of value in Gandhi, and we don't romanticize what is reactionary.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Shambhavi Jha. Thank you for the insightful lecture, sir. One question though. Speaking of Gandhi's principle of non-violence, the fact that he took an active part in the 1899 Anglo-Boer War himself, volunteering his services to the British and enlisting himself in the ambulance corps, and once again offered his active service to the British during the 1906 Bambatha uprising against the Zulus, seems absurd. And we never find him regretting his role in either of the two wars. What are your views on the same?
Yes. Well, you see, my more nuanced, complex view to Gandhi, as I've written at length, there are certain things, especially that Gandhi did in South Africa, and it's roughly 21 years there, which, unlike apologists, Gandhian apologists, I say, for me, some of what Gandhi did was racist. It was unconscionable that such a nonviolent person, moral person, would act the way he often did. And he often knew what he was doing. For example, in the first Boer War there, Gandhi's basic sympathy were more with the Boers than with the British. When it came to the Zulu Wars, the Second Zulu Wars and so forth, Gandhi was just shocked by the savagery the British had against the Zulus, just mass execution. And Gandhi's sympathy was basically with the Zulus on the whole. And yet he supported the British, even through nonviolent ambulance corps and all these things. But he was complicit with the British war effort because he was willing to use the native indigenous South Africans, Zulus and others, the Boers and so forth, as a means to his ends, which was to show the British that he was loyal and that so that they would look favorably on Indian efforts towards greater independence. Now, this is to me the worst form of means ends exploitation. The one correction I would make is Gandhi did regret a lot of what he did, and he certainly did. Especially, he did support World War I British effort, but then in the years after that in India, he had second thoughts about what he did. He returned the British war medals that he received for that service, and he is very self-critical about a lot of his earlier positions, including his justifications for war, even if he was complicit, even if he directly was not violent. So I think that Gandhi, in fact, grew. That's the way I look at Gandhi over the decades. And to me, the Gandhi even later in the 1940s is the most advanced Gandhi. And on issues of racism and colonialism and casteism and so forth, I think the later Gandhi is the one, in fact, who is the most developed.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Akansha.
Mm-hmm.
We'll take Purvai first. Sir, as you mentioned how Gandhi was not interested in projecting abstract philosophical ideas, but inclined towards something more practical and workable, I would like to know if Gandhi was reading any of the contemporary philosophers' works, if he was particularly impressed, in quotes, by any of their works.
The basic answer is no. Gandhi was interested in some philosophers, and if you look at on Hind Swaraj, it's kind of interesting. He lists about 20 sources of people to read. And what's interesting, because contrary to the impression in how he presents it in Hind Swaraj, about 17 of the 20 sources are Western. Gandhi definitely, and he cites Socrates, but he mainly read the one work, the Apology, the defense of Socrates when he's being tried and convicted. And so Gandhi holds up that view of Socrates as a philosopher. And Gandhi was influenced by Tolstoy, by, these are not technically philosophers, Thoreau, Ruskin. And of course, Gandhi knew a little bit about some of Indian philosophy that influenced him, some of the Upanishads. He knew a little bit about Vedanta. Gandhi knew, when you say contemporary, Gandhi knew people like Radhakrishnan. Radhakrishnan was the president of India when I came there, was a great popularizer of Indian philosophy, Hindu philosophy, Vedanta. Gandhi greatly admired Radhakrishnan, and they interacted, and Gandhi responded to many of Radha. So he knew something of some of the other 20th century Indian philosophers. Gandhi certainly interacted with them. But I think the important thing is that Gandhi was not really interested in 90% of what was being done in philosophy, including contemporary philosophy. In other words, Gandhi was not reading Husserl or Wittgenstein or, others you can mention. And so for me, what's interesting about Gandhi is what's innovative. What is he doing in a creative way that these other philosophers were not doing?
Okay, thank you, sir. Now we'll take up Akansha's question. Sir John Gultang, the founder of Peace and Conflict Studies, divides violence into direct and indirect and structural forms. Do you feel that there is a resemblance in Gultang's and Gandhi's typology of violence?
Yes, definitely. And Gultang, of course, was influenced by Gandhi. And there were others, who was the founder of a whole deep ecology and who at one time was a Gandhian, right? And so these conflict resolution were very influential. Many of them were stronger. Gandhi is one of the formative influences on them, right? And my distinction that I made as I developed it is that I did independently of them, but it also resembles some of them. I think my position, I tried to defend Gandhi is more revolutionary. That's mine. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in pushing the conflict resolution people, many of whom I know very well, pushing them a little bit beyond their normal framework, but certainly consistent.
Okay, so thank you so much. And
Thank you.
now we'll take the last question for the session. And
Okay.
this question is from Pranav. He's asking, Sir, we all and the overworld are suffering from COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
Gandhiji's trustworthy theory, how long, far relevant, and how much importance of their trusteeship theory in such types of pandemic situation, where in present time this trusteeship theory of Gandhi used for justification of crony capitalism. And my second question is why Gandhiji was a supporter of consensus election and did not believe in voting system.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things that in the Gandhi spirit, part of my approach to at the end is to be a kind of catalyst to challenge people, which I think is in the best Gandhian spirit. When it comes to the pandemic, okay, so right now, to me, the United States has by far the worst record. It's unconscionable. The United States is the wealthiest country in the world. We have the most advanced, at the most advanced level of medicine, of technology, of science, doctors, experts, and yet we have right now the worst record. Over 7 million Americans have suffered COVID. And it's actually much higher than that, but that's what's reported. We have a government that wants to repress testing. And we have, over 210,000 deaths. Some estimates are by the end of 2020, this will double. We'll have 400,000 deaths in America. India now has the second worst record. And for a while, I was very confused about India. Because when you look back March, April, while the pandemic now was raging in New York and we had so many cases in the United States, India was reporting several hundred cases, hardly any deaths. Now, this did not conform with everything I knew about India. To me, not just India's population, but when I looked at India's healthcare, which is its technology, its medicine, which is very advanced for the well-to-do at the top level, as advanced as what we have in the United States. But when I looked at everything I knew about rural India, the hundreds and hundreds of millions of people living in rural India, so many people living in cities that I knew who were living in slums, people who are living, they don't have homes on the streets, people who are packed together in terms of trains and buses and transportation and living conditions and lack of access to good health care. I would think that India would have a terrible record on the COVID-19. And now, of course, what's happened is in recent weeks, India now has the second most cases in the world, with rising, raging death rates. So my position is that if people listen, again, Gandhi doesn't have all the answers. Gandhi has a lot of good answers about healthcare, about hygiene. And of course, we could go through a lot of that specifically. They're very concrete things that Gandhi would say that would limit the spread of the pandemic. And also deeper structural, relational points that Gandhi makes that would help us understand why the masses of Indians, the have-nots, do not have access and are most vulnerable. Disproportionately are the people who are suffering and the people who are dying. And how can we change that? Okay, so to me, if the people in India, the ruling class, the government, the medical, the top medical, if they had more Gandhian values, that would have helped. There would be many less cases in India, and tens of thousands of Indians who have died would still be alive. Okay, and that's even more the case in the US. Trusteeship is an interesting, I've written at great length about trusteeship and how that would do. Again, I see it in very nuanced, complex ways. There are things that it depends how we formulate trusteeship, right? And it takes many different forms. One of my big concerns I've been asked to intervene is some of the Maine uphold a few super wealthy capitalists in India who supported trusteeship. There weren't that many, but one of the Maine down in Wardha, down there, they have recently discontinued. They're dropping their support of Gandhian efforts down there, right? And so to try to figure out why that is happening. Trusteeship can be very, very good. They're very positive things, but to me it's mixed. And I tried to analyze how some of the forms of trusteeship, in fact, were complicit with violence, even in the name of nonviolence, and kind of justified a power structure that was kind of a charity effort and maintaining, trying to convert the wealthy, the powerful, but allowing them to continue to own the land, to own the factories, and in many ways complicit with the ongoingness of violence and exploitation in India. So that's a very complex issue. I see that trusteeship is important, but it's only one of many, many efforts. By itself, it's not sufficient. You have to supplement that with all kinds of other Gandhian efforts of resistance, of organizing, of mobilization, and providing positive Gandhian values. Now, voting, that's interesting. On a lot of things, Gandhi is controversial. Gandhi has a radical view of democracy, much deeper than what we have in India, as he said, in the UK, much deeper than anything we have in the United States. And so Gandhi was quite skeptical about the dominant, liberal, Western forms of democracy. And that's why right at the end, the last days of his life, he was calling for the dissolution, that his party should withdraw, that Nehru and Patel and others, they should basically go back to the villages, right? And because he saw the kind of the normal voting patterns were corrupt, that people with wealth and power controlled the process. He sometimes referred to the politicians as prostitutes. They were simply carrying out the wishes of their masters. So for Gandhi, our normal democracy was a way of suppressing the voice of people and of basically controlling their resistance, their nonviolent organization, their alternatives. So Gandhi wanted substantive democracy, but was not simply based on voting, right? And he has a lot of things that he says there. It tends to be highly decentralized. He recognizes the need for state power, but basically that should only be what we can't do locally, right? And he felt that on a local level, you know your neighbors, you know your school, you know your community, you care about them. There are a lot of important truths here. In our work right here where I am, we have big efforts, often related to Gandhi's position. How do we support local farmers? How do we support local industry, food, water, our communities, rather than being dependent on outside, globalized, transnational forms? And so this is part not just of a healthy economic community, but it's part of affirming these kind of Gandhian values, moral, truthful values that we have of how we can all flourish together as human beings. So there's a lot of truth to that, but the challenge is we live in a globalized world. We live in a world of huge state power, right? How do Gandhians, right, relate to that? For us, in the work we do, voting is important. It's not an end in itself. It's not the major thing. But for example, with the people I work here, it's really important to vote to defeat Donald Trump and some of the extreme right-wing racist, homophobic, sexist, anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner, and so forth, Republicans who now control the Senate and many other bodies. So we encourage people. We see how those forces are doing everything to repress the vote. They don't want Muslims to vote. They don't want people of color to vote. They don't want to allow immigrants, people here, to vote. Those are not the real white supremacist, true Americans. So we are encouraging people to vote. But we have no illusion about Biden, about Harris, about a lot of these Democrats who are beholden to the big special interests. But in fact, what we are saying is it's important to vote. But that's not an end in itself. Then you have to mobilize. Then you have to organize. If Biden becomes elected, you then have to, in fact, have grassroots pressure. and pressure from those progressive politicians so that we have better environmental policies, so we have better economic policies, better cultural policies, better nonviolent policies. So it's a very complicated issue. And Gandhi, again, has a lot to say about don't make a fetish out of voting, right? As if that's the only thing you can do. But at the same time, recognizing that sometimes voting is a very important thing to do.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions so patiently. And sorry to say, but due to time constraint, we won't be able to take any more questions. And with your permission, sir, we'll email the rest of the questions to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir. And now I would like to call Shahana ma'am to present the vote of thanks.
I would like to, and now this is the formal vote of thanks, but truly it's been so wonderful and inspiring to hear you. So I would like to thank Professor Douglas Allen on behalf of all of us here at Kirori College for this wonderful, meaningful and thought-provoking talk and enabling this really lively discussion. I would like to thank the principal, Dr. Vibha Chauhan, the coordinator of the seminar, my colleague, Dr. Amit Suman, my other colleagues in history at Kirori College, Dr. Anshu and the entire IQAC team for organizing this. And I would like to truly thank this audience for being there, for engaging with these issues, and for all the students who organized this. The meaningfulness of this talk today, the utter urgency of engaging seriously, historically, and dynamically with Gandhi's philosophy in today's world is clear, even as the resistance to such engagement in the world is equally and utterly daunting. I know that Gandhi and Professor Douglas Allen have both given us a lot to think through and think about. Thank you, sir, and thank you all once again.
Thank you, everyone, for your keen interest and larger participation during the course of last 4 lectures. When we had planned to organize this webinar, main purpose of organizing it was also to celebrate the birth anniversary of Gandhi, but we also intended to have larger participation, at least from our student side. And it was so heartening to see that our students have contributed to the success of these lectures. And last 4 days were really engaging, inspiring, and also challenging for all of us to have such kind of lectures from personalities ranging from the section of philosophy to politics to history. And also we were fortunate enough to listen to many ideas and philosophies of Gandhi, ranging from, say, his ideas about casteism, his ideas on Gandhian philosophy, Gandhian politics, and also a bit about relevance of Gandhi in the modern contemporary world. So though tomorrow is the last day of our webinar series where students and participants will discuss their concept of Gandhi, their ideology about Gandhi, and their thoughts on Gandhi and what they have learned through these 4 lectures. But I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks on behalf of each one of us to Professor Douglas Allen, who's so kind to accept our invitation on such a short notice. And he is here still. Shahana and I was talking about his level of energy, that at such a senior age, he is so energetic, so involved in the process of this lecture. We all should feel inspired by seeing your commitment to the larger discourse of academics. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. And now I would invite our students to present a formal vote of thanks from our department aside. Sharanya, I would like to request you to kindly read it. So, Professor,
Okay, sir. So before that, I would request Nandini to present a vote of thanks on behalf of the History Department.
The best and the beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt by heart. Thank you is one such prayer among them. Good evening, everyone. I consider it a great privilege to propose a vote of thanks to all the dignitaries who have witnessed it as a memorable and successful event. On behalf of Kirori College, I would like to thank our chief guest, Professor Douglas Allen, sir. You shared your thoughts and experience with us. Your guidance is very precious to us. You gave us your time, the precious of all. Thank you. I would like to thank our principal ma'am for all the words of wisdom that radiate a source of energy within us. Heartfelt thanks goes to all the department teachers who always stand by us and guide us. Thank you so much. An event of this dimension cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling months in advance. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very dedicated students committee and volunteers. This event was not possible without your invaluable contribution. Thank you. Last but not the least, I thank all the students for showing their interest in this webinar. Your encouragement always helps us to carry out such important events. Once again, thank you so much to assemble here. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, we are concluding this session and looking forward to your participation on tomorrow also. And once again, lastly, thank you so much, Professor Allen, and looking forward to many more opportunities. Thanks for joining us.
So, on behalf of the History Department, I would like to present the vote of thanks. So, respected Professor Douglas Allen, thank you for delivering this gripping and thought-provoking lecture on 6th October 2020 as a part of international webinar on relevance of Mahatma Gandhi in the 21st century, philosophy, political ideas, and social and spiritual dimensions, organized by the Department of History in collaboration with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell IQAC, Kirori College, University of Delhi. Your presentation was very well received by the students and imparted valuable insights. We all look forward to meeting you on campus in future. Students Union, Department of History, Kirori College, Delhi University. Thank you, sir.